Both the Republican and Democratic parties are in internal civil wars, and no better issue is demonstrating that than the current one with Israel and Palestine. Let me explain. First, let's do some quick political theory. One thing you need to understand is the concept of the horseshoe, especially when it comes to politics, or what's also known as horseshoe theory. Horseshoe theory simply states that if you're in the center of the political spectrum, the farther left that you go, eventually you end up turning back around and going to the right. Similarly, if you go too far to the right on the political spectrum, you end up countering and slightly going back to the left. Let's look at some examples. One of the easiest examples to think of is any point in which people on the far right and people on the far left actually kind of agree with each other, even if it's for different reasons. One very simple example to understand is vaccination rates. And we're not just talking about vaccines when it comes to recent issues like the pandemic, but we're talking about in general. Florida, which is a heavily Republican state, and California, which is a heavily Democratic state, have some of the least vaccinated populations in the United States. Why is that? Well, on the far right, you have a huge distrust of big pharma and big government. These are people only be eating meat, who might be in all that manly right-wing stuff and not want any kind of vaccination produced by a federal government. But you have that on the left too, even if for a different reason. In fact, you might have people like vegans and vegetarians who hate big agriculture, who stay away from any large mass-produced product, and also do not want their kids vaccinated because they hate big corporations, and big corporations are the one producing these vaccines. So even though you might have individuals voting for completely different political parties, they might agree on certain issues. This also goes for government handouts. So once again, we can apply the horseshoe theory to, let's say, boomers who might be senior citizens collecting government payouts through retirement incomes, the most popular one being Social Security. Now, in my opinion, Social Security is a government handout, but we know for a fact that the majority of the people receiving Social Security vote Republican. They do not want their Social Security or their government handouts taken away. This is also true for people who might be in the inner cities, who are poor, and who are receiving government handouts through, say, food stamps, who by and large vote for the Democratic Party. They also do not want government handouts to be taken away or limited. That puts both of these parties at odds with anyone who wants to cut government spending. Now, the third example is what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and it comes down to Israel and Palestine, which is very interesting. And we're going to see how this is creating a huge divide between both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Now, traditionally, because of the military-industrial complex, the majority of America and Americans, especially in the political class, are okay with a certain amount of war. But after over 2 to 3 decades of being in nonstop wars that have taken forever and a huge amount of American resources, all while the economy continues to decline, you're seeing factions split on both parties that are becoming anti-war. Now, if you remember back in the day during the Bush-Al Gore election, it was often the Republican Party that was pro-war, pro-invasion, a term that we normally refer to as neoconservative. But now that's kind of flipped, and that really flipped during the Obama years, in which Obama was actually a very aggressive pro-war president. Even though there was no formal war involved, he was a fan of covert opportunities, covert actions, and he's very infamously memed into being the drone president for the amount of drone strikes that he committed, especially in the Middle East. We see that now more than ever during this Ukraine and Israel fiasco. Democrats have almost party line supported sending funds to Ukraine, which is very odd for a party that just 2 decades ago was an anti-war party. Republicans, on the flip side, have actually been more anti-war. Even if they claim it's over government spending, they have tried their best to stop money from flowing into Ukraine. Israel is another example of this. Now, for the most part, our entire political class is pro-Israel, but a lot of the people who vote for this political class are not, and that is both on the left and the right. So let's think about this. Well, if you go on the far left when it comes to issues like Israel, the factions get a little bit more complicated. A lot of Democrats vote for funding Israel. More often than not, we have bipartisan efforts to fund and give money overseas for a variety of weapons programs and intel funding to the Israeli nation state. However, on the far left, we know that there is a lot of people in the Muslim religion who might have Arabic or Middle Eastern roots at large. And these are no more better personified than people like Rashid Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, who respectively in their districts, which are very far left in their political views, are also of Eastern descent. They are very anti-Israel and very the anti-Israel lobby. They often support the BDS movements, the boycott, divest, and sanction movements against the Israeli nation state, and are doing their utmost best to ensure that Israel gets no funding. These people are very loud and they're very vocal, and they're currently at odds with the rest of the Democratic Party. This is really important because you see this no better place than the amount of protests that are going on throughout the country. Kind of reminds me of the BLM protests back in 2020 or 2021. We saw protests like we've never seen before in a very long time in more cities than we've ever seen due to these Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the people who are outraged over the U.S. government sending money to Israel. Now, on the Republican side, you have something very similar. Since Donald Trump, the Republican Party's anti-war faction has grown increasingly so. What that means is now you have people on the Republican side who are actually very against sending Israel money, whether that's for fiscal responsible reasons, as in not wanting to increase the government debt, or for wanting to simply take a more nationalist approach and focus more on affairs at home. So what does this mean? That means that neither party, neither the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, currently have a unified front, and both of them are at risk of losing voters. Now, I could give you some anecdotal evidence which might change your mind, but certainly one could say that the current people who are marching for these anti-Israel protests are not going to want to vote for Biden. Biden, after all, is main stage in funding Israel, and he's the one who has yet to try to force Israel to stop the atrocities over in Gaza, or at least what the far left views as atrocities. Now, you have the far right, of course, saying very similar things, but the far right has never really liked Israel. In fact, a lot of them have never really liked a Jewish state. And that is where both the far left and the far right align. So how is this going to play out? Well, I've talked to some of my Muslim friends and I've asked them, I've said, hey, are you going to vote for Biden if it's a Biden and Trump election, given everything Biden is? And Biden is the one who is currently trying to send aid to Israel to further impose warfare on the Gaza Strip and on Gazans and Hamas. Their answers range for a variety of reasons. Half of them have told me that no, not in any way, shape, or form will they be voting for the Biden administration. This is after, by the way, they did vote for the Biden administration over Trump in 2020. However, the other half have said, unfortunately, even though they disapprove of Biden's actions, they don't think Trump would be any better, and they would still end up voting for Biden even in a general election in 2024. This is where politics becomes very interesting and very dynamic, because in our United States, we have two large parties who have to represent a lot of people. In fact, our two large parties have to represent up to 300 million people. That means there's going to be a lot of different factions within those parties vying for control, and warfare brings out some of the largest divisions within those factions. Now, the margins were slim in a majority of the swing states that Biden won in 2020. What that means is he cannot risk losing any voting factions that he had in the 2020 election. And Muslims were a large part of that faction. Muslims, and especially those on the anti-war left. So what this means is that both parties are going to continue to experience a quasi-realignment. This war has brought about divisions that were not seen before and are forcing factions within both parties to fight with one another. If either party is smart, they will try to continue to stoke the flames and divide on the opposing party's current anti-war and pro-war factions. What that might look like is the following. If I was a Republican operative, I'd be doing everything I can to continue funding marches for the Democratic Party. In fact, I would continue to try to prop up people like AOC, Rashid Tlaib, or Ilhan Omar to ensure that their voices are heard more for the anti-war faction. I'd be placing the bet that the more traction that they gain and the more power that they have, the more likely that those voters will not vote for Biden in the 2024 election. Even if those leaders decide to come around and say, hey, we still need to support Biden, a lot of their voters might simply not do so. And that's a very big deal, especially since a lot of the people that I just mentioned are operating in either swing districts or swing areas. In conclusion, horseshoe theory is incredibly important. Horseshoe theory, which dictates that the further you go to the left, sometimes you end up on the right, and the further you go to the right, sometimes you end up on the left, is very critical to understand our modern day political system, because it is simply not just a straight line. In fact, the further you get away from the center of politics, the more controversial your opinion is. The more controversial your opinion is, the more likely you will find common ground with others who have controversial opinions. We see this all the time, and we'll continue to see this long into the future as our politics continue to become a little bit more divisive, but also as both political parties continue to try to find a common ground within their coalitions. As those coalitions continue to break apart, I expect to see certain factions of those coalitions either dropping out from the party in which they're currently allied with, or potentially even switching parties.